What if a man could kill himself, not out of despair, but as a calculated act of war against the living? Tonight, we explore a story so strange, so coldly brilliant, that you'll be left wondering, was it a ghost story, or something far more sinister? This is An Original Revenge, by W.C. Morrow. Published in 1897, our story begins with a letter. Not just any letter, a farewell letter. But not the kind soaked in grief. The narrator of our tale, a writer in San Francisco, had a passing acquaintance with a young private soldier named Gratmer. A sensitive young man. Proud, romantic, delicate in spirit, the kind of soul utterly mismatched with the rough, grinding life of the military. Gratmer had taken an interest in the narrator's published stories, which he liked to call psychological studies. And it was clear that Gratmer himself was preoccupied with certain, unusual questions. Questions about the life beyond this one. The letter the narrator received was, at first glance, a desperate cry, a suicide note. Gratmer wrote that by the time these words were read, he would be dead by his own hand. But as the narrator read further, something shifted. This was not despair speaking. This was strategy. Gratmer named a specific officer, his superior, as the man who had driven him to this decision. And then came the line that changed everything. He was committing suicide, not to escape, but to gain, through death itself, the power to take revenge on his enemy. He believed that in spirit, he would be far more powerful than he ever was in flesh. And true to his word, Gratmer was gone. But the manner of his death was extraordinary. He did not hang himself. He did not use a pistol. He walked into a small canyon near the military reservation, and detonated a charge of dynamite. He obliterated himself so completely that only minute fragments of flesh and bone were ever recovered. Scorning even the dignity of a funeral. Scorning the ceremony of grief. Leaving nothing behind, except his purpose. Now let us turn to the man who had made Gratmer's life unbearable. He was an older officer. Short. Florid-faced. Hot-tempered. The kind of man who had fought in 2 wars and 100 battles and believed that gave him the right to crush anyone softer than himself. He had never understood Gratmer, the dreaminess, the sensitivity, the philosophical bent. And what he did not understand, he attempted to destroy. But now something strange was happening to this Iron Man. The changes came gradually, then all at once. The officer began avoiding solitude at night, the very man who had always lived alone and liked it. He started seeking the company of others after dark, while shunning them during the day. When his fellow officers teased him about it, he would laugh, but it was a strange, hollow laugh. Wrong. Off-key. Sometimes he would blush so violently his face turned almost purple. And then there were the other signs. He would suddenly start, as though something had spoken to him. Turn sharply. Answer in monosyllables, to questions no visible person had asked. And at night, the screaming. Word spread through the garrison. The old bulldog was cracking. Those brave enough to offer sympathy, mostly women, wives of other officers, were driven away with violent verbal barrages. Even the garrison surgeon and the commanding general were rebuffed when they tried to ask after his health. The man who had faced cannon fire was clearly suffering from something that no weapon had ever managed to inflict on him. Something undiscoverable. Something the doctors couldn't name. Then came the most extraordinary development of all. The officer, a lifelong scoffer at the supernatural, a man who had always dismissed spirit communications as charlatanism and nonsense, was seen, one evening, leaving the rooms of a spirit medium. The narrator witnessed it firsthand. The old soldier's face was purple. His eyes were bulging. He was barely able to walk, and had to beg a policeman to call him a carriage. The narrator rushed up to the medium's rooms and found her unconscious on the floor. When she came to, she was terrified, and not just from the séance. She looked at the narrator standing in the doorway and cried out. "It is horrible for you to hound him so." She had mistaken him for the spirit itself. Once calmed, she confirmed everything the narrator had suspected, the dead soldier had been appearing to the officer. And tonight, this very night, it would end. The officer would be murdered. No earthly power can prevent it, she said. The narrator did not go to the police. He did not warn anyone. He ran to a livery stable, hired the fastest horse he could find, and rode furiously into the night, not to prevent the murder, but to witness it. It is not often, he reflects, that one may be in at such a murder as that. Cold. Clinical. Fascinated. He spotted the officer's carriage crossing a dark ravine near the military reservation. He saw the hack sway strangely on the road. He thought he glimpsed a fleeing shadow, dark, fast, disappearing into the tree-lined wall of the ravine. They stopped the carriage. The door was hanging open. Inside, they found the officer, not seated, but crumpled on the floor. Face up. His chin pressed to his chest. Utterly still. They lifted him onto the seat. His head rolled with a terrible looseness, the looseness of a neck that no longer had any purpose. Another match was struck. A ghastly dead face. Wide eyes. Staring at nothing. The officer, the warrior of 2 wars, the crusher of sensitive young men, was dead. The narrator told the driver to take the body to headquarters. Then he turned his horse around and rode, calmly, back to town. He stabled his horse. He went home. He went to bed. He would later note, with something approaching dry amusement, that he was the mysterious man on a horse, whom the coroner could never find. A year passed. And then, another letter arrived. This one bore a postmark from Stockholm, Sweden. The sender identified himself only as a long-time reader of the narrator's psychological studies. He wrote that he had recently found, in a library in Stockholm, a newspaper from about a year prior, describing the mysterious death of a military officer in a hack carriage in San Francisco. He suggested this story as material for one of the narrator's tales. But that was not the disturbing part. The correspondent from Stockholm offered a theory. What if Gratmer had never actually killed himself? What if the dynamite explosion had used a dog, or a carcass, or some other body, rather than a human being, to fake a death so complete that no identification was possible? What if Gratmer was still alive, had never been a ghost at all, and had instead physically stalked, terrorized, and ultimately murdered the officer himself, while disguised as a supernatural visitation? What if the spirit medium had been in on it from the beginning? And what if Gratmer, the dreamy, sensitive young soldier, was in reality something far colder and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined? At the bottom of the letter from Stockholm, a name. The correspondent had signed himself, Ramtarg. Ramtarg. The narrator notes that it sounds odd, but that it may simply be a respectable Swedish name. And yet, something about it haunts him. Something he cannot put his finger on. Something like a dream you know you've had but cannot remember. And if you haven't noticed it yet, take the name Ramtarg, and spell it backwards. So what are we left with? A ghost story, or a murder mystery disguised as one? A haunting, or a human being cold enough to fake his own death, terrorize a man for months, arrange a séance, and then kill him in a moving carriage on a dark road? W.C. Morrow leaves the answer deliberately unresolved. The narrator himself says, the whole affair is of too grave a character for treatment in the levity of fiction. And perhaps that's the most disturbing thing of all. Not the ghost. But the possibility, that there was no ghost. Only Gratmer. Patient. Brilliant. Utterly ruthless. And quite alive.